The relationship with Truman was not a warm one, but with all other presidents, yes, he was close to them. He was very close to Lyndon Johnson, who I think was probably his best friend at all outside of his immediate circle. And of course, Nixon and the senior Bush and Clinton were all close friends. But he tried to be nonpartisan after his disastrous relationship with Richard Nixon, and I think largely succeeded. He fell off the wagon 2 or 3 times after that. He's drawn into politics. He could hardly stay out of it. It's like a moth drawn to the flame. But he tried because he realized after the Nixon debacle that he'd made a serious mistake.
Yeah, you talk about the Nixon debacle. He was good friends with Nixon. He defended him. And he was also caught on some of Nixon's notorious tapes that were made in the Oval Office. Right.
The conversation that usually is highlighted is the one that he had with Nixon in 1972 about Jews in the media. And Graham said some noxious things at that time. He thought it was a private conversation with himself and H.R. Haldeman, but it was being recorded, and it came to light in 2002. He was mortified. He apologized in person and writing. He even traveled to Hebrew Union University to issue apologies face-to-face. And he had no explanation except to say that I was rolling along with the president, and I let him say things that at that time I didn't really believe, and he said I certainly don't believe them now.
Grant, I'm also, I want to highlight his wife, Ruth. At her funeral in 2007, he said, "We were called by God as a team. He will be laid to rest next to her at his library in North Carolina." What kind of woman was she?
She was a force of nature. She was extremely smart and witty, quick-witted. She wrote prolifically, mostly poetry, on some devotional writing, and she was never all that impressed with his accomplishments. She certainly kept him down to earth with her wit and her realism. She was more conservative than he was politically as well, and so I imagine they had to talk some things through.
Joining us also on the phone is historian Doug Weed. Doug, Vlad mentioned Billy Graham's proximity to power, that he counseled basically every president, starting with Harry Truman, all the way up to today. And it occurred to me that because of his proximity to power, he also found himself facing the nation at some key moments in this country's history. Many people may not be aware of, especially if you're younger, may not be aware of the role that he played during the civil rights movement. I was reading that Lyndon Johnson asked him to go to Selma to help to ease racial tensions, and that he encouraged Eisenhower to send troops to Little Rock, Alabama, to help the safe passage of high school students, black high school students that were trying to get into the Little Rock High School.
Yeah.
This one's for Doug.
Mm-hmm. He was very cautious. I don't know how else to put it. Very reluctant, very careful in his relationships with politicians. When I worked in the White House, he would call very timidly and suggest that he had an idea for the president's speech that was going to introduce him, that he'd very sheepishly, and I'd assure him, "Oh, of course, we want any ideas, any suggestions you have," and then he'd send in these stories about himself that the president would read. That was a side of him that my staff and I had not seen before. We realized that this high-wire act, when you're dealing with powerful people, it takes a lot of work, and you have to want it. You can act reluctant, but you can't be reluctant, or you're not going to get in there.
Grant, this is a question for you. Let's talk a little bit about Billy Graham's early life. I understand that he was born again in the Christian faith back in 1934 after he heard a preacher in his home state of North Carolina. What kind of a man was he? What kind of a childhood did he have up until that moment where he chose to follow the path of Christ?
I would say the most remarkable thing about his childhood is how unremarkable it was. He was just a very ordinary southern farm kid. The farm he grew up on, dairy farm near Charlotte, was a prosperous farm. It was not a deprived childhood. But then it was ordinary in that he cared about girls and fast cars and baseball, and then went off to Bob Jones College in Tennessee in those days. He didn't like it very much. Stayed there a semester, and then he went to Florida Bible Institute for 3 years, and then on to Wheaton College. It was after Wheaton College that I think he really gained his wings, if we could say, and began to sense both his calling as an evangelist and probably beginning to gain a sense of his own extraordinary abilities.
What do you think it was about the way that he preached that spoke to people in 1945? This was different than what they were used to.
Yeah, there were two important things to say about his preaching. First, one is the content, and the second is the manner of the preaching. On the content, he had an exceptional sensitivity to the events of the age, what was going on. He read newspapers avidly, and so he related the events, political, social, natural disasters even. He related them to enduring spiritual problems. So people could play